Swinging in Frog Hop is used for traversing gaps and reaching areas in a level that you can't get to by normal means. Watching the previous video, which I'll link here, will help you get a better understanding of what this video will talk about. To start things off, the game functions by giving the player different states. In this case, there's a normal state, where normal physics are applied to the player. The physics work with the X and Y values, where X is left and right, and Y is up and down. The basic rules are, when you press left or right, the normal movement speed is applied to X, and if you're in the air, gravity is applied to Y and you gradually fall faster until you hit the ground, which would then set your Y speed to 0. So now let's get onto the swing nodes. Now when you press attack at a swing node, you enter an alternate state. We'll simply call this state swing. In this state, the swinging physics are applied to the player and the normal in-game platforming physics are no longer applied. This means that the X and Y speeds are all set to 0 and we use a new set of values to properly apply the swinging physics. Let's first focus on the basic rules of how the swing works on the fundamental level. Gravity is applied, much like how I described how being in the air has gravity applied. The only real difference is that we utilize special values called sine and cosine, which are used to make our movement on the swing node radial. Now, depending on where you are positioned on the swing node, the left and right inputs will apply a continual force while you're swinging. Because of the fact that the swinging uses a completely different set of variables compared to X and Y, there are a few details that have to be taken care of. 3 of these are, there needs to be an adjustment made if the player connects too close or too far from the swing node. The second is, when the player releases from the swing node, the movement from the swinging needs to be translated back to the normal state physics. And when the player attaches to the node, we need to apply some of the speed from their normal state onto the swinging one. So let's start with the adjusting the distance from the node. When the player connects too close or too far from the node, we make them enter the swinging state and have a logic gate that simply helps adjust their distance. So a logic gate, to simplify it, it's just a means of filtering a piece of information so that if it's one thing, then it goes to this part, and if it's not, then it goes to the other, and vice versa. And they can come in different arrangements as well. So in this case, our logic gate simply checks if the player is too close, we gradually make them move to the correct distance, and if they're too far, we just instantly snap them in place. This is all happening on a frame-by-frame basis, so since the game runs at 60 frames per second, each frame will slowly adjust the player's distance from the node until it reaches the intended range. Now, the most difficult section to code was getting the player's swinging state and physics to be translated to their normal state. So one of the biggest issues is having to go from using a different set of variables that don't use X and Y. So it really is a lot like translating one language to another so that the end result makes sense with what it intended. The way I went about solving this challenge was by checking the quadrant in which the player is positioned from the swing node. So if they are in the bottom left and they release, the speed that they are experiencing in the swing is properly divvied up and then applied to the X and Y speeds. The other thing to check, however, is also if they're swinging clockwise or counterclockwise. Because of this, it took a lot of careful adjustments so that we don't have weird, incorrect values being applied. So here's a very simple example. If you're swinging and decided to let go at a low point of this quadrant, we have to make sure that it applies more speed to the X instead of the Y. Same goes for if you release at this quadrant. You probably want more Y speed versus X speed. And if we're swinging clockwise instead of counterclockwise, we would also have to adjust accordingly if they release at the low or high point of the same quadrant. Lastly, when the player connects to the node while moving, we have to apply the player's normal movement speed to the swinging one when they connect. Much like how we had to code it so that the player can release off the node, when the player is flying across the screen in any direction but then decides to connect to the swing node, we need to apply the speed they have to the swinging one. So it's essentially the opposite of the previous concept, except all we have to do is just translate the X speed or Y speed to the swing speed and direction, which also uses similar design to the release translation code. From a fundamental design perspective, this is pretty easy to comprehend. From a coding standpoint, however, coming from someone who's more of an artist than a coder, it took a lot of trial and error to reach this point in the code. So if you think it was easy to figure this out, it was most certainly not, and it was definitely not figured out in one perfect run. All right, let's get on to the coding section to get a little bit more in depth as to how the swinging works on a coding standpoint. So we'll kind of run through this. This might take some time because, again, the swinging, there's a little bit more that goes on with it in terms of the math, but I'll try to explain it in a simplified way as best as I can. Here we have our variables. So the variables, just like think of it kind of like a file folder that you can store data in. So in this case, we can store any kind of data we want in our folders. So swing is the name of our variable, and this is essentially our swinging state that we enter on and off depending on if we collide into the swinging node with our tongue attack. So there's that. Then of course we have length, which we use to determine like the optimal distance we want from the node. So we can change this, so we could set it to like a distance of 100 so that the player would be swinging 100 pixels away from the node. But in this case, I found that 27 was a pretty good range. Node, the node equals 0. So when it's 0, it just means that the targeted node that we're connected to, it doesn't exist. Basically, we're not connected to anything. But if we were to be connected, this value would change to kind of like an abstract number of sorts that's kind of long, and that's just used to identify the unique node in the room so that we don't end up connecting to the wrong one. Then we have swing dir, or swing direction, which just simply takes our coordinates and it points towards the node so that it gives us like a sense of what our angle is. So if we were directly below the node, swing direction would be pointing straight up, or if we were to the left, it'd be pointing straight to the right, and so on. Swing dist, or swing distance, is literally what it means. It grabs point distance. Literally just means how many pixels we are from one position to the other. So it grabs our position, and then it checks the position of the node that we're connected to, and then it gets the distance. So it's a nice little function that's built in. Previous swing direction simply grabs our previous position on the last frame, and then it just checks the direction, just like how swing direction works. And this is used to help adjust our kind of like our radial movement around the node. Swing speed is literally what it sounds like. It's our swinging speed, and then swing speed cap, that just prevents it so we don't go spinning and swinging all over the place at like an insanely high speed. So in this case, I found 9 to be a pretty good number, where it doesn't cap too much. Cap means like it doesn't make it so like if we were to swing too slow or we were to swing too fast. So I found 9 to be a pretty good number. Swing face. This is more for the visual aspect. Whenever you play the game, you'll notice that your left and right inputs will actually make the player character kind of like face a direction, and that's actually intended more for a design standpoint, just to help so the player can tell that their inputs are being read and that they are influencing their swing. So that's not really actually a physics thing. It's more of a visual design aspect. Swing add helps with adjusting our acceleration with the swing speed. X_L and Y_L NA. These are more for the actual like kind of like calculating the position adjustments. Launch angle, X launch, Y launch. These are all intended for exactly what they sound like when you press jump, or you do the tongue attack in such a way that you end up flying off the node. So the release, of course. The swing gravity, that determines just how fast you'll fall as you're swinging on the node. Friction, which has been shorthanded, just simply affects how much we slow down. So if we were to not press any inputs, this would help make it so that, just like real life, if you were swinging on a rope and you weren't kicking your legs around, gravity would naturally bring you down to a halt, and then eventually you'd be directly below the node. Swing gravity direction, it's 270, which in Game Maker, direction is, so 0 is to the right, 90 is up, 180 is left, and then 270 is down, which would make sense. So if we wanted to go crazy, we could change the gravity here to be a different direction, but of course, it's the rule has been established that down is gravity, so that's why this determines the direction. So we're just kind of quickly skimming over this because we'll run through it in a more fundamental way, because it's a lot to take in, since again swinging requires a lot of logic. So let me show the function for when you collide into the swing node. So with the swing object, the swing node, when the player, this block of code simply checks if the player's tongue attack, if it connects with the node, and then they enter that new state. So just to quickly scan over it, this just checks if the player is alive. And then if the player is already connected to this node in particular, doesn't have to do anything. This line of code is what checks if our tongue attack collides with this node. And then it will play a little ding, like a little sound effect. It sets our player swing state to true, which is the swing state that I was talking about, and we're no longer applying the normal physics. It gives makes the player target this node so that it doesn't go for the wrong one, and it'll give it a unique set of values so that it can target this node in particular. These variables just simply initialize the setup so that it properly applies our movement ahead of time. This is just for effects, so it only plays once, which is why there's a repeat variable, and it runs this block of code once, so that way it plays this little flash effect. So it creates a little object that kind of flickers for a second and then it disappears. So that'll kind of give a bit of a rough idea as to how it works on a collision standpoint. So let's actually get to the meat of the swing mechanic. Here's our player input script. So this is the block of code where we handle the swinging inputs. So this line just checks if we're in our swinging state, which in this case we are. And we'll keep going down. The green text is just comments, which is why there's a double bracket. That's just used to help the coder understand what they're dealing with, so that if they're navigating through thousands of lines of code, they can quickly just kind of be like, oh yeah, this is what that is, and then they just keep going. Swing as what applies itself to the X and Y position. X underscore L. This grabs how our distance from our X distance from the node, and then YL grabs our Y distance. So if you were directly to the left of the node, X underscore L would be, I believe, 27, and then Y underscore L would be 0, since we're directly to the left of it. And 27 because if you remember back in the where I was showing off the variables, I said 27 because of the that's the distance we've set up. And underscore A, this just determines the angle. Swing speed equals swing direction minus previous swing direction. This is what gives us our movement. So now this block of code from here to here, what this does is, so if you remember, the third point was how when let's say the player is flying across the screen and then suddenly they decide to connect to the node, it determines where the player is positioned and their speeds, and then it applies the proper swing speed value. So that way, if you're flying across the screen at really fast and then you connect to the node below you, let's say you're flying to the right, if you connect to it, you would think that you would naturally start swinging to the right as you connect to it. So that's essentially what this code does. Each of these blocks here, you can see there's this is a logic gate in and of itself, because it's basically checking the quadrant that we're positioned in, so that it'll properly apply the position, or the speed, to the player's swing speed. So DL means down left, DR means down right, UR means upper right, and then, upper left for the other one. So that's all this code is. I'm not going to get too in depth with it, but the basic idea behind it is it just checks the X speed and the Y speed during our normal state right before we connect to the node, and then it applies the proper values so that we're naturally connecting and moving at the right swing speed. The length adjustment, which was one of the first points I believe I talked about. So this short block of code right here, this just simply determines if we're too close to the node, then we would gradually keep moving the player back each frame so that they're at the right distance. And if the player is too far away, it would just instantly snap them. And I think I did it this way just because I wanted to make it so if the player did something really awkward, I didn't want them to be too far away from the node and doing some kind of weird exploit. So I believe that's why I snapped them immediately versus being too close. X velocity and then Y velocity are used. I believe these are just used to help for debugging purposes. I don't think they actually take part in the actual code, but this is used to mainly help for debugging purposes. This code right here is actually just visual, so it just checks if left is pressed, then make the player face left. If they're pressing right, make them face right, and if neither, then just face towards the screen. Up and down inputs doesn't really do much. Jump, if jump and you're not touching a block, it will launch us off the swing node or just drop us depending on how fast we're moving and where we're positioned. If A is pressed, it does actually very much the same thing. The only difference is it will make us attack instantly versus just neutrally just dropping us off the node. So here's the physics for the swing node. This is where the magic happens. First, we just check if our state is swinging, which in this case we'll assume it is. It checks if, this block is for a gimmick, so it's an alternate swing node, but we're just gonna focus on this. So this just makes sure that our swing speed cap is set to our normal one that we set up before. Swing gravity, that's just how high our gravity is, which is the starting one that we had from the beginning. This block of code right here just simply prevents you from spinning out of control and going too fast for both directions. That's why there's a negative, there's like a little minus here that you can see. This is just to prevent the other direction from going too fast. Because I think an error I made was I didn't have this block of code, and the speed would be just fine for one direction, but then if they went the other way, they would just start revving up like a car engine and just fly across the screen. So yeah, we don't want that for the other way. So that's why that's added. So for these two lines of code, the Y change equals and then the swing direction, these, to keep it simple, it just adjusts our directional position depending on where we're facing the node. That's all it does. So these two lines of code, the X and Y, that's literally our X and Y position that will be moving our player around. So if you remember from our last episode where we had the X speed and Y speed, that this is where it's actually happening. So these, to keep it simple again, it uses, if you've heard of the term trigonometry, it uses that to give our movement kind of like a sense of radial movement. And here we have the swing release code. So the first line of code, which is pretty much the most important line of code here, swing equals false. That sets our swinging state to our normal state so that we're able to play the game with the jumping, platforming mechanics and the movement, all that stuff. This just simply prevents us from flying at the speed of light. X launch and Y launch, these are what determines how much X speed or Y speed we're going to apply depending on where we release on the swing node. And so these just simply help adjust those values so that for later we can translate those to our X and Y speeds. These just simply determine the direction in which we're swinging. So if we're swinging counterclockwise or clockwise, and then depending on which way we're going, it then checks the quadrant, which if you remember that I was talking about, this is where each of these parts is happening. And this just allows it so that, if you were to spin clockwise and then you released at the bottom left, it wouldn't make it so you would fly the opposite direction what you think you would fly at, if that makes sense. So if you're swinging to the right and then you jumped off and then all of a sudden you flew like backwards, that wouldn't make much sense. So this just makes sure that these values are translated properly. This is more of a game design blocks of code right here. These are just for unique mechanics like flying into blocks that you can destroy and like smash through them. Node equals 0 is also very important too, so that we can connect to a new node. The other important, the icing on the cake, is the x velocity equals x launch, y velocity equals y launch, and that's what gives us our movement when we release from the node. All right, well, I do apologize for how complex this section is, but I do hope it kind of gave you a very rough idea as how it works. Again, it took a lot of trial and error, and I do want to say up front, there are many different ways to code something. So I do look back on this code and I do think that there probably would have been a much simpler way to do it, but that just kind of comes from experience, just making and finishing games. You just kind of start to realize that there are ways to code better. So if you're looking at this code and you're a coder and you're kind of cringing like, oh, it would have been better if you did this, like, you're probably not wrong. There are many different ways to code something, which is kind of the beauty of doing code, is the fact that there are many different graceful solutions to a problem. Usually, I mean, that's usually the case. Or many practices that are very effective versus just brute forcing and doing a lot of really rough code, which you're kind of witnessing here is the madness that I had to go through to eventually figure the logic out for this swing code. Anyways, thank you for watching, and I hope you enjoyed learning how the swinging mechanics work. If you are curious to know how other parts of Frog Hop or my other games were coded, feel free to ask your questions below, and I'll see if I can make a video about that. Feel free to check out Frog Hop, which can be purchased on Steam or itch.io, and thanks for watching.